This is not the ideal release cadence of the game. That's obvious, right? They would love to announce that 9.1 is coming out in a couple of weeks, but they're definitely playing catch up a bit. It's gonna come out in July. They thank everyone for their patience and have more content planned after 9.1. This will not be like Worlds of Janner. There will be a 9.1. Okay, perfect. That's good to hear. Good. There's a lot more to come for Korthia and the PTR. They want to get PTR up as soon as something is ready for testing, and they're ready for Korthia. Korthia is going to have more zone events, daily quests, and rares. They want to give more to Outdoors World players. I think the Korthia thing is good. I've tested it a little on PTR. They're going into the right direction with it because they're basically removing everything people hated about the Maw. People hated the Eye of the Jailer, and people hated not mounting. They fixed both of it, right? So I'm hopeful for Korthia to be a good zone. What's the deal with the special Sylvanas bow? They talked about whether or not this should be an artifact or a legendary. They have tech from the artifact system about being able to give an extra special button. Is that something they want to do often? This item will be hunter only. So you're basically saying it's a weapon, but with like an extra ability, basically. Just like... Okay, I see. I personally don't like it when there are certain items that drop in a raid that are almost like mandatory to have in other contents. I don't mind being certain items that are slightly better, but not something that is like far and beyond better, right? And a bow that gives you a special ability seems like far and beyond better, but we'll see, right? Okay, what's the deal with Mega Soul Ash? Mega Soul Ash will be obtained from layers 9 to 12 and used to upgrade your legendaries past 235. When you complete layers 9 to 12, you'll also get the rewards from the lower layers. Okay, yeah, nothing to say about this. This is exactly what they should do, right? The only thing that I would want them to do is also increase the Soul Ash drop from layer 8, right? So you can get your rank 4 legendaries quicker. That's something that I definitely would want them to do. Then, what's going on with Conduit Energy? Conduit Energy is imperfect. They wanted to avoid another system where you swap to conduits on every boss. During the PTR, they want to focus on cell binds that feel mandatory to balance the system better. They want to draw the distinction between viable and optimal. They want to avoid situations where people are swapping every day, but every week. That seems they want to accommodate. Okay, so I actually was watching this when he talked about this, and I have something to say about this that I personally just don't understand behind the logic, because their logic is that they don't want players to feel the need to change conduits between every boss or between every arena or between every blah, blah, blah. Which, here's the flaw in the logic that I am seeing. If the difference between soulbinds would actually be smaller, which it is not right now, but let's assume the difference would be smaller, okay? Let's say the difference between like Nia and Dreamweaver would only be like 1% or something, right? If that would be the case, then the people who are not min-maxing wouldn't feel the need to swap anyway, right? A person that is like, doesn't want to go and switch conduits all the time. A person that is not trying to min-max, that wants to enjoy the game, doesn't want to go switch conduits all the time, doesn't want to go like do whatever. Like that person, if the difference is much smaller, that person wouldn't care so much then, right? That kind of player wouldn't care about going and switching all the time, right? Why make Conduit Energy a thing when it only would be the like top end of the players who would be switching anyway if the difference is so small? You know what I mean? Like I feel like this argument is kind of like the logic is like contradicting itself. One more thing that I want to mention is that I don't think they can ever balance soul binds properly. I don't think that is even a possibility, even if they wanted to, because soul binds are the same for every class and spec. How could you possibly balance 3 soul binds that are class generic to be within 1% or 2% for all specs and aspects of the game? Like, that is like an impossibility. There's literally just no way that's a thing ever. And that's why I'm so confused and why they would even think that that's possible. I think it's fine if it's not balanced, because again, I think it's impossible. So I personally don't mind that I always have to play Nia, right? Like, I think that's fine. If I play Nia on like 3 out of my 4 specs, then I play Nia 3 out of my 4 specs. So what? Like, that doesn't bother me. Does it bother you? The only thing that bothers me is that I can't switch my conduits. I don't care about like the different soul binds. I care about not being able to switch my stupid conduits. That's what I care about. The much, much, much better solution would be to have spec-specific trees. And I don't understand why they never even consider this. Like, why can't they just have it? So let's say I play Balanced Druid, and I have Nia. And then I put conduits in my tree, in my soulbind. And then when I switch to Feral, my conduits are gone. So now I have to put new conduits as a Feral. So whenever I switch specs, I will get the conduits that I put in with that spec. Like, why can't it just work that way? Because then at least it's like slightly less annoying with different specs. You will still have an issue between like M+ and raiding and PvP, because if you play a Moonkin and you want a PvP, you want to have those conduits. If you're a Moonkin and you want to raid, you want to have those conduits. So you still have the same issue of needing to switch conduits for different content, but at least it will be less of an issue, right? But the way it is now, I have 3 soulbinds, I have 4 specs, and there's 3 different aspects of the game. There's Arena, there's M+, and there's raiding. Obviously, I don't play every aspect of the game with all of my specs, but let's assume I would want to do that. How would I be able to do that? Like, how would I be able to play 3 aspects of the game with 4 different specs when I have 3 soulbinds? That's just, it just doesn't make sense, right? And the only issue is the conduit energy. Like, I just wish they would consider other options to solve this issue. Specifically, the thing that I just talked about with the spec, and that is a thing that I already suggested during beta. And I really wish they would consider that. And I know that Blizzard said, well, we have different soulbinds, and they're for the different specs, but there are classes who have 3 damage specs. And the soulbinds are kind of damage healer tank, or like damage utility survivability. So, I mean, usually you have one soulbind that is the best for damage. That's just kind of how it is. So what are you going to do when you have 3 damage specs? Play the healer, like, I know that it's not supposed to be like a healer soulbind, but that's kind of how they set it up, right? So, I don't know. Going on with the changes to Torghast, you'll see a lot of these in the next PTR build. One of our fundamental problems of Torghast was binary. It was death counter or Torghast. Okay, so they're removing the death counter or the Torghast, which is great. They're adding a meta Torghast talent tree, which will be similar to a Vision talent tree. I don't like that, but fine, I guess. All right, so Torghast follow-up questions. No plans to give Torghast gear progression. That's good. I like this. There are more Mythic Plus like efficacy, but also perks called blessings. Okay, interesting. Okay, so class sets are not in 9.1, but he did say that they're going to be returning after 9.1. So the raid after next raid is going to have class sets again, very likely. So that's hype, right? Like, that's what everyone wanted. I personally am not the biggest fan of class sets, but a lot of people do like them, so that's hype, I guess. Okay, so basically what they want to do is they want the bonuses to be really strong in the raid, but also work outside of the raid as like a weaker way, which is good, I think. The covenants are cooperating, but each covenant has a separate identity and ideals. I actually don't mind the covenants. The only thing I do mind is that it's too difficult to swap. I mean, that's just it. Like, that's the issue. The covenants themselves are not the issue. The covenants that it's just too difficult to swap. And I also don't think it should be like something where you like snap your fingers and you switch your covenant. But I think it is kind of like a meaningful choice if you if it doesn't take you 2 weeks to do it, you know? And if it doesn't take you like 10 hours to grind 80 renown. Because next patch we're going to have 80 renown. And you know, it's going to take quite a while to farm 80 renown on like if you have never swapped to that covenant, right? So at that point, I feel like just making it a little bit easier to swap, would it really be less of a meaningful choice then on what covenant you choose to do? Because I'm pretty sure people would not start swapping covenants every day if it's slightly easier to switch. Because, I mean, how many times do people even switch their covenants? Like, rarely ever. So, I don't think it would be that big of a deal to make it slightly easier. But yeah, whatever. I guess, I mean, that discussion is kind of pointless because they've resisted for so long to make it swappable that they're not going to give in now, right? Like, at this point, there's no point to even try and convince them about it because they just made up their mind and it is what it is, right? So, Moving on. What are your thoughts on borrowed power? What borrowed power means is that you have soul binds and covenants are borrowed power, right? You're basically gaining power from a system that is expansion specific, and the next expansion you're going to lose it. And the reason why they do this is because the only other reason to give you power would be through class abilities or like legendaries and tier sets. Then it would be too crowded, right? Like if there wouldn't be any borrowed power and they would constantly just give you new abilities, class abilities, then they have to take away some abilities because they can't just keep giving you more stuff. Because then at some point you just have like 100 abilities, right? So they have to like take away stuff. But the problem is people complain about pruning so much that it's easier for Blizzard to give you borrowed power from an expansion because then you already know it's going to be gone from the get-go. Like I totally understand everything about this reasoning here. I personally hate it though. Like I wish they would just give us new class abilities and take away others. I wish they would do that. But I know why they don't, because people would just complain too much. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is true, but I do think that the bigger issue here lies in PvP. The difference in item level might not be that big of a deal in raiding, but in PvP, it's like a much bigger issue because of versatility. Like I think in PvP, it's just way more noticeable because more item level in PvP gives you more HP, more damage, and more survivability. Like it just kind of scales exponentially, and then all of a sudden it's like this huge difference in PvP. Because in PvE, you kind of scale with damage and not so much with versatility. Like the extra stamina you gain from your gear in PvE is not that big of a deal. Survivability you gain from your gear is not as important. But in PvP, it is very important. Your damage and your survivability is very important in PvP. So that's why you scale much higher. Like the curve and the way you scale with gear in PvP is like this, while with in PvE it's like this, right? So that's why I do think this is a much bigger problem in PvP. But they haven't really addressed, like they haven't talked about it in the interview. They only talked about like PvE scaling. They didn't really address the PvP scaling, so I don't know. I can't really, they didn't really have an answer to it. Then there's a lot to do in PvP. It's already any plans for the catchup. They're happy with how the renowned catchup is working. I agree. I think renowned catchup is fine. There are areas to improve still, I'm sure. If you're already playing a campaign, you've already done it. It's not very exciting. Yep, that's also true. The hard part is trying to balance the different styles of play. Some players want ults as for the end game, while other players want there to be ults because their main has stalled. Yeah, I understand the issue, but I don't think that justifies the way Soul Ash works. What he's saying is that basically some people like the journey, and if there's too many catch-up systems, then there is no journey anymore. Something that I would consider a journey is like certain quest lines and certain renown and stuff like that. But doing Torghast every week is not a journey in my opinion, because it's like the same thing over and over and over. Like it's not a different thing every week. It's the same thing every week. I don't think it's a fun journey for people to be like, oh my god, nice. I need to farm 3 months of Soul Ash in Torghast. Yay! I don't think people think about it as a journey, but more of a time gate. And I don't think time gates are usually that much fun for people. But, I might be wrong. Then, any plans to change the healer DPS inequality? That is something that we're discussing. Both Holy Paladin and Disc Priest is talked about a lot. Holy Paladin, part of the issue is the default playstyle. Another part of the issue is Ashen Hallow. I think the only issue is Ashen Hallow. I think that Blizzard should start by nerfing Ashen and then see what happens. A lot of the times, Blizzard is shooting overboard with stuff. And I think this is a perfect example. I think if you nerf a Paladin's Ashen Hallow, that's where you have to reassess their damage, right? I don't think you have to nerf a Paladin's damage across the board. Just nerf Ashen and then see what happens, right? Especially since we're going to be removing Pride. A big reason why Ashen Paladin was so good, we have Prideful as an affix, which further enhances big cooldowns. Big cooldowns are just emphasized by the Prideful buff. And we're not going to have a Prideful buff anymore next season. So I do think that Paladin was so strong because of Ashen Hallow and because of Pride. If they're not going to have Pride anymore, and Ashen Hallow is going to be nerfed, then I don't think that Paladin necessarily have to be nerfed even further. So I'd rather them nerf Ashen and then reassess the situation. And not nerf Ashen plus nerf all of their other damage, and then they're going to be useless, right? And then the Disc Priest problem, I don't even know if I think the Disc Priest problem is Disc Priest existing. I think Disc Priest existing is a problem. Because I know we're like mainly talking about damage here. Disc Priest does damage as like their main rotation, which is already an issue for healing in general. Because if there's only one healer who is providing damage and healing at the same time, that's just creating this imbalance, right? So let's say both Resto Druids and Disc Priest are like exactly the same value healing wise, but a Disc Priest is doing damage while he's healing, and the Resto Druid is not. Yeah, like how to balance that? And then the other issue that Disc Priest has is they have Absorb, which is indefinitely better than healing done always. And I know Ian said the Absorb should only be better if there's stuff that kills you. But this is like a wrong statement to make, because Absorb is always better than healing done, even if things don't kill you from 100 to 0, right? I can't think of a single situation where healing the damage would be better than absorbing it. Like, I'm not even playing healer anymore, and I'm just very passionate about Absorbs being too OP. It has been an issue since like Mists of Pandaria. Because in Mists, Spiritual was completely broken and Paladin had Absorb 2 from their mastery. And it felt so bad to be a healer that was not a priest or a paladin. It was incredible. Like all the healers had all of this Absorb and damage came in, but no one actually took damage because everything was absorbed. And I'm just standing there, like, trying to heal people, and I just can't. And it's just felt horrible. And there were times where Disc Priest was not that good. But that's the thing. Either Disc Priest is broken, or it's garbage. And I feel like there's just never an in-between. Right? Because Absorb, it's because of the fact that Absorb is just too good. And they do damage. So you have, like, this situation where either they're complete garbage, or they're just the best healer, like almost, you know? Then, what are your thoughts on raid utility? AMZ is too good with AMZ. Yep, agreed. Rogues are lacking in raid utility. Okay, so the reason why I disagree with this, the reason why I don't think rogues should be getting raid utility is because they have already so much utility in their toolkit that is still very good, it just has not been very obvious in the Castle Nathria raid. There's been so many bosses in the history of World of Warcraft where rogues were basically needed because of their utility. But there hasn't been any bosses in Castle Nathria where it was very obvious or where it was very needed. And now all of a sudden rogues need a raid utility? Like, I disagree with this wholeheartedly. There has been times where you wanted to stack like 4 rogues, or sometimes even 5, because they can solo everything. The problem is not rogue having too little utility. The problem is other melee classes having too much stuff that is like required, you know? It's like, you need 5% magic damage, you need attack power shout, you need 5% physical buff for monks, you need all of this stuff. And most of this stuff is being provided by melee classes. And that creates a problem where you only have a certain amount of melee slots, right? You can only bring like 5 melee. And like 4 of those 5 melee need to provide a buff. I don't think the solution is to give rogue more stuff. Like, just I don't know, just remove raid buffs. And then also this sentence here, I want to talk about this. He said, they want to raise the number of total melee spots in a raid encounter up to 7 or 8 melee and are working with the encounter team to do so. I almost feel like he said this knowing that they won't be able to do it. That's almost what it feels like. Like, it feels like he knows that they're not going to be able to make this a thing, but he's still just going to say it. They haven't been able to do it in the past. How would they do it now? Because I'm pretty sure this has been a thing. Like, the problem that melee have very limited spots in raids has been a thing since I can remember, like since MOP. And there has only been very few exceptions where melee were actually getting the amount of raid spots that he's mentioning here. Like having 8 melee on a boss has been a thing on like 2 bosses, maybe 3, in the last like 10 years. So I don't see how they would all of a sudden be able to do this. Because the issue with melee not being good is not the fact that they don't do enough damage or they don't provide enough utility. It's literally the restrictions of boss design because you have to be in melee range to your target. Like, that is literally the reason. Like, bosses became more complicated the longer the game existed because people get better at the game and we have more add-ons and we have more ways of dealing with boss mechanics. Blizzard had to make bosses more complicated, right? By making bosses more complicated, you automatically have to add mechanics to the fight that are not favorable for melee players. A melee player has to be in melee range to the boss or to the target to be able to do something. And that creates so many balancing issues or so many restrictions on what kind of abilities you can give a boss. Give an ability where you need to spread out, like quaking. Bam, quaking makes melee not so good anymore. Because there's like a finite amount of space around the boss. But it's not just that. Like, it's not just spread out mechanics. It's also split target mechanics too. Like, as soon as you have a main target and then off target somewhere else, ranged generally will be like better at switching to these targets because they don't actually have to move because they actually have range on it. So as soon as you have a boss fight where, you know, like the melees need to walk over to another target, then you're slower at moving over. It's much harder to deal with all of the other mechanics in the fight. Yeah, think about Raden, for example. That's a very good example. On Raden, you had the orbs spawning, and you needed to focus them quickly. Why were melee not so good on this? First of all, you could theoretically pre-walk there as a melee and then attack them as soon as they spawn. But then you had the issue that there were melee walking through the room, right? And all of a sudden you had problems with other mechanics of the boss fight. There's other mechanics like the lightning that jumps from one person to the furthest other player. So if there's melees running around all over the map, maybe the lightning jumps to the melee player instead. Because it's just like disruptive behavior if you have players running around. Because the ranged players, they just stand still and hit their targets from range. So that's not disruptive, right? You can create strategies around that. But as soon as the melee players are walking all over the place, then all of a sudden you have issues with like the boss's mechanics, right? So that's why it's just really difficult to create boss fights where having extra melee is not a disadvantage. Oh yeah, anyway, let's move on. How do you feel about the AoE cap? There's definitely room for continued evolution. They still hold to the goal at niches, at 2 target. I actually hate to be complaining about all of this stuff, but like I do agree with like a lot of things they say, but sometimes they say stuff where I just wonder, like this sentence here, for example. They still hold to the goal at niches, at 2 target cleave, 4 target cleave. They're moving in the right direction, but have more work to do. So basically, what Ian said is that he wants classes to have like a niche. So let's say warrior is like the best at like 4 target cleave. And then mage is the best at like uncapped AoE. And then this class is the best at like 2 target cleave and whatever. If you want there to be like niche things for class, like if you want a class to have a niche, then there needs to be the content where this niche is actually required. And that's where the issue lies. The issue is we have Mythic Plus and we have raiding. They are just not designing content for all of the niches to excel at. So what's the point at me being good at 4 target cleave when there is no 4 target cleave? Or what's the point for me being good at spread out AoE when there is no spread out AoE? What's the point of me being good at 3 target cleave when there is no 3 target cleave? You know, like that's the issue. You can't have niches and then not actually put that niche into the game. How would you possibly make that work in M+ without completely ruining the fun of it? The problem with M+ is the less stuff you can pull, or the more you're trying to restrict people from pulling, the less fun it actually becomes for players. And we see that in Shadowlands. Like, we totally see in Shadowlands that there's so many times where they try really hard to make the dungeons so you don't pull too much. If you think about Spires of Ascension, you have the platforms. You can't pull more than what the platform has, obviously, right? So that's like one restriction. And then they put another restriction in. They have squad leaders. They apply an AoE damage reduction aura to all the mobs around them. So they added another restriction to not do AoE pulls. Right? And they did this stuff throughout a lot of Shadowlands dungeons. Like, a lot of Shadowlands dungeons had these kind of restrictions where you cannot pull more stuff even if you wanted to. What this has been creating is just anti-fun mechanics, basically. Because I think most people like big pulls. And Ian said that the issue with big pulls is the fact that the tanks cannot tank the big pulls, and therefore they have to start kiting, and that's why it's bad. So if they don't want tanks to kite, then why is necrotic even a thing, right? Like, that's kind of like anti-logic. They say they don't want tanks needing to kite, and at the same time we have an affix called necrotic, which is literally forcing tanks to kite. I just think this kind of niche thing that they're trying, the damage dealers, like they really want to put the damage dealers into these niches, which theoretically is not a bad idea, but with M+ existing, it kind of is. Even if M+ has like certain, like a niche or whatever, then it would still just make that class the best. And that wouldn't solve the balancing that M+ has, right? Because let's assume in M+, let's say you constantly pull 4 mobs. It's like 4 mobs into 4 mobs into 3 mobs into 4 into 5 into 4. If that's the size of pulls you do. And then there's a class whose niche is for target cleave. Well, then that class will be the best class in M+. Does that solve anything? I don't think so. It just makes a different class the best. I don't see how this is solving any of the issues in Mythic Plus, you know? But yeah, that was all about the Ian interview. I do think overall that we got some good news about new content. We got some good news about 9.1 and about 9.2. Set bonuses coming back in 9.2. About them. I like the idea of Korthia being like no Eye of the Jailer, being able to mount. I like the idea of not needing Soul Ash for legendaries above rank 4. I like a bunch of stuff. I like them addressing the issue of AMC being broken or nerfing it. I like the fact that they're I like the fact that they want us to bring more melee players, which I still don't think that's gonna happen, but whatever. At least they're trying or pretend to try, I guess. And then I don't like their answer about Conduit Energy. I think they should just give in. Like, I really think they should just give in. Just drop it. Or at least make it spec specific. Or don't make it cost Conduit Energy if we put a conduit in an empty slot. Like, they need to just meet us halfway at least. And I don't think the Conduit Energy regenerating quicker is like an actual solution. I think the other things that I mentioned are much better of a solution. Like, if they're gonna meet us halfway with the Conduit Energy, then it should be the spec thing that I mentioned. That your conduits are spec specific. So once you switch your spec, you switch back to the conduits that you had selected with that spec. And when you switch to a different spec, you switch back to those conduits that you had selected with that spec. So at least when you switch your spec, you will get the conduits that you have for that and not constantly have to switch from one spec to the other. That would already solve like a lot of issues. It would still not necessarily solve the cross-content issue, like people wanting to play PvP and Raid and then Plus. That would still not be solved. But at least it would be better with different specs. Yeah, that's it about all of that. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Tomorrow we will be